Okay, I think we're running a little ahead of schedule, and I've been encouraged to start. I'm Marc Schulz. I'm a psychologist. I come from another neighborhood different than economics. I also came up here from Philadelphia. Really honored to be here. Interesting symposium. I appreciate the invitation, Professor Phelps and the center. Quite an institution you have going here, and part of what I'm going to talk about today is another institution that's been going on for 85 years. So I'm really pleased to be here to talk about it. I'm going to start with a story about two of the participants in this study that has been going on for 85 years, and I'm going to introduce them to you. By the way, I'm hoping to leave time for questions. I'm looking carefully at my timer, so I'm going to encourage you to think and to join in the discussion at the end. So on the left is a man named John Marsden, and John grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. He was in a family that was a relatively wealthy family in the dry goods business. He was a really good student in school, really interested in ideas. He was also teased a lot when he was in school, what we would now call bullied as he grew up. He was a good enough student. He went on to go to Harvard University. He became a philosophy major, continued to think about ideas, and was really quite stimulated by that. Did really well at Harvard, decided early on he wasn't going to pursue the family business, was going to go in a different direction, and for him that was law, which he did eventually. World War II intervened. He volunteered to serve in the military but didn't pass the medical exam, so he served stateside during the war. And after the war, went to the University of Chicago, graduated at the top of his class, worked at a leading law firm, taught for a while as well, consulted with the government, led what we would think about conventionally a very successful career. He married a little late for this cohort. John, I should have said, was born in the 1920s. He married at age 34. Leo on the right was a child of Vermont, of New England, grew up in Vermont in a family that was upper middle class. He too was a good student, ended up at Harvard. He was a history major. He loved writing and dreamed of being a writer and a journalist, was what he really wanted to do. He was asked to join the study that I'm going to describe in his sophomore year. World War II broke out about the same time when he was in school. He volunteered and served in the Navy in the Pacific Theater for several years. He kept very detailed notes of that experience while he was serving in the military with the hopes that he would be able to publish something when he was finished his war service. His dad unfortunately died during the war, and right at the end of the war when he came home, his mom developed Parkinson's, got diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. So Leo moved back to Vermont to help out his mom and to help his family out. Soon after, he started teaching high school at a local high school. He started teaching history, and he was a beloved teacher for 40 years. He never left that job. So his hopes of becoming a writer were not pursued. He was not able to do that. He met the love of his life soon after he moved to Vermont, so he was younger than John when he married. His wife, Grace, was someone that remained an important person in his life for his entire length of his life. The study that I'm about to describe characterized Leo in this way in one of the first meetings of Leo when he was at Harvard at school. The interviewer says, "I came away from our visit with the impression that the subject was, well, somewhat ordinary." So let me describe their life in a little more detail from the way that we were able to follow them in the study. We followed them up at age 50, and one of the questions we asked was what they were earning. And not surprisingly, John, who was a lawyer, was earning more than almost 3 times as much as Leo, the school teacher. We asked them the question, life has more pain than pleasure. John said true. Leo said false. I often feel starved for affection. John said true. Leo said false. A man feels good. This was a fill in the blank. A man feels good when, John reported, he's able to respond to inner drives. And this was something John talked a lot about, coming to realize his true self and to pursue his interests, very much focused on his kind of inner experience. Leo gave a very different answer. He senses that his family loves him despite everything. A little bit later, now age 62, 1987, we're getting more recent. When you're upset emotionally or sad or worried about something that is not related to your wife, what do you do? John, and by the way, this was John's second wife at this point, John says, I keep it to myself. I tough it out. Leo, I go talk to my wife. It's very natural. I certainly don't keep it to myself. She's my confidant. And finally, when they were age 79, near 80, we asked them to describe, and using 5 adjectives, the nature of their relationship with their partner. John, again in a second marriage, what he described as loveless, offered these 5 adjectives: tension, distant, dismissive, intolerant, and painful. Leo, very different and quite beautiful: comforting, challenging, feisty, pervasive, and beautiful. So let me just summarize, and I'm very aware of where I am and what the main focus of today is. John Marsden, very successful at work, top of his competitive profession, high earner, conventionally very, very successful, very focused on himself, divorced, estranged from his second wife, estranged from his family, relatively unhappy in this large sample, over 700 people, and very disconnected. Leo DeMarco, on the other hand, had to make big compromises in his life. He became a beloved teacher, by the way, quite embedded in his community, loved by students and by colleagues. Thought about himself primarily in relation to others, married throughout his life, strong ties to his children and his grandchildren. So 2 takeaways before I get to any data here. Connections are important, and rich people can be miserable as well. Let me tell you about the origins of the study. This was a study that began in the 1930s, a time I don't need to remind this group about, but I often do when I talk to younger folks. We were still in the throes of the Depression. It was the eve of World War II. An unusual thing happened in Boston. 2 separate studies began, both with a focus on human thriving. So not what was going wrong, but an attempt to understand human flourishing. The first study was a study of inner-city adolescent boys facing real adversity. So these were boys that were growing up in the toughest neighborhoods of Boston, the poorest neighborhoods, mostly in tenement buildings. Most of them were children of immigrants facing real challenges and certainly the experiences of being marginalized. Across town in Boston, on the outskirts at Cambridge, were 268 sophomores in consecutive years at Harvard that were chosen at that time to study normal development. Someone had the idea that Harvard students were normal. And they were followed also for the reasons that I suggested, to try and understand human thriving and how people develop. So very different contexts and possibilities or prospects for life. All 724 were followed across their entire lives, so into adulthood, middle adulthood, late life, in fact, to their death. The study is ongoing, so we've expanded the study along the way to include partners of the original participants, and we're now studying more than 1,300 of their children. So this has been going on for over 85 years now, and it's still an active enterprise. Very briefly, this was a study from the beginning that was really interested in trying to understand people's experience, what was going on inside their head. You didn't start my timer. What was going on inside people's heads, and what their daily experience was of life. So they were followed very closely, interviews of all of the participants, interviews of the parents, observations of these adolescents or young men interacting with their parents, questions for the parents about what the kids were like. And throughout the study, that kind of close, intense study was a feature of the study. Medical exams, they were poked and prodded in a number of ways, which I'm happy to talk more about if there are questions. And then during the next intervening 8 decades now, regular questionnaires about every 2 years, lengthy questionnaires they filled out, mostly closed-ended questions that psychologists ask with a focus on thriving, but also opportunities for them to answer open-ended questions and to tell them what we were missing, and they did. They often told us what we were missing. Interviews at least every 15 years, often closer to 10 years. In the last 20 years, more modern techniques that psychologists and neuroscientists are using. So we scan their brains while they're doing various activities. We looked at the shape and size of different structures in their brains. We collect blood to get a sense, a window into how they're doing physically. And we also bring them into the lab to both observe them interacting with people that are close to them, and also stress them out and see how they react, their bodies react, and how they react emotionally to those stresses as well. Best stressor for people in the lab is speaking in front of others. A few lessons. This is really about longevity, and I'm just going to say this quickly because I think it's so important. This study, as well as many others, make it very clear we want to take care of our body like we're going to live in it for 100 years. So what does that mean? We don't want to smoke. We want to limit the amount that we drink in terms of alcohol. We want to exercise, and we want to visit the doctor. The more germane lessons for our focus today is that social factors matter in this study and in many other studies. And I'll give you an example quickly of social status, and then I'm going to focus the rest of my time on connections and relationships with others. This is a simple figure here in purple on my computer here. It's the inner city boys as they grew up, and in red are the college young men as they grew up. And what we're looking at on the y-axis here is the percentage of the cohort that either had died or was significantly disabled, that they were having trouble with the tasks of daily living. And what you see is a clear divergence in these curves, so that at age 65, they diverge by about 30 percentage points. So this is an indication that inequality has a cost. There's also a big educational difference here. Only 25 people in that 400-plus group of inner-city boys made it to college, whereas most of those Harvard men, in fact, all of them graduated from college eventually. So disparities exist. They're tied to socio-demographic factors that we know about from lots of other studies. A few years ago, my colleague, who is the director of the study, I'm the associate director of the Harvard study, we decided to step back and try and think about, across the hundreds of findings in the study, is there a kind of signal? Is there a common sort of robust connection that we can make? And this was the signal that we saw very clearly. I'm just going to give you 4 headlines. If we look at trying to predict psychological and physical health in one's 80s, the best predictor is midlife relationship satisfaction. It's not cholesterol level, it's not income level, it has to do with your connection, in this case to an intimate other. Childhood parenting matters. So across 60, 70 years in the study, the initial ratings that folks did in the 1930s when the studies began of what that childhood environment was like helped predict the quality of people's relationships late in life. It also predicts the way they cope with adversity as well. It's a 6-decade prediction, which is quite amazing. It's a modest connection, but it's there. Time spent in this study and many other studies, the more time you spend with others, the happier you report yourself being. Of course, the relationship is likely bidirectional, but this is a common finding. The quality of your relationships in your 80s predicts something about your cognitive decline 3 years later. This is particularly true for women. Folks who are in more secure, more satisfying intimate relationships showed less cognitive decline 3 years after we had measured the quality of their interaction. So these are just 3 findings, but they point to a similar idea that connections matter. I'm going to show you some data from outside the Harvard study just to show that it's not peculiar to the folks that grew up in Boston. I want to do a Boston accent, but I don't do it well. And it's not peculiar to folks that grew up almost 100 years ago. So this is a study of studies, a meta-analysis of the factors that predict premature death. Hard to see maybe for this group, but at the bottom are the usual suspects: hypertension, obesity going up, physical activity, alcohol consumption, smoking. The length of the bars or the width of those bars suggests how much risk that confers for premature death. What's missing here is social connection, which is really at the top of this. So if we look at the risk associated with social connection, it's similar to the risk that we associate with those clear physical health factors for premature death, or for the amount of time, the length of your life, the longevity of your life. I'm going to show you data from another study here. This is a famous study that was published in Science in 1988. It's also a study of studies. It's 5 different studies, each with multiple samples. It's a little complicated, but I just want you to focus for now on the y-axis, and we're going to look at 2 of those studies. On the top are data from Evans County, Georgia, which is a rural county west of Savannah. And what you see here, just focusing on the y-axis, is that blacks in Evans County, Georgia, are more likely to die at any age. They have a higher risk of dying than whites in Evans County, Georgia. We can also turn that around to longevity figures. Whites are more likely to live a longer life than blacks in Evans County, Georgia. We can contrast that with Finland, where people are less likely to die at any age, and they're going to live a longer life. So we see, again, clear disparities, complicated to think about the differences between those two places, but clear disparities. But that's not what I want folks to focus on here. The x-axis is important, and these are indicators of social connection, how connected people are, measured in lots of different ways, how many friends, how many confidants you have, do you have good friends, do you have the support you need? It's measured differently across these studies. They all show a similar negative relationship here, which means that people who are more socially connected have less risk of dying at any age. So we see this across countries, across different types of studies, and across time. So Bob Waldinger and I decided we had enough of a signal here and across the many studies that have happened internationally at this point to write about this. And our book is, sounded like a good title until I came to this symposium. Everyone's been talking about the good life, but it's called The Good Life. Simple conclusion is that good relationships keep us happier and healthier throughout the lifespan. I want to emphasize, even though I've given a lot of examples about intimate relationships and they're important, it's all kinds of relationships that are important. I want to talk very briefly about loneliness because it's an important public health topic. So the UK was sort of ahead of the US in 2018 because of concerns about social disconnection and the risk for health problems. They appointed a minister-level person in charge of the loneliness portfolio. In the US, back in May this year, our Surgeon General announced a crisis in social disconnection. So this is similar to the advice that's been offered about smoking and cancer. And Vivek Murthy talked about this as a crisis because of how prevalent loneliness is, estimates as high as 50% in most modernized, industrialized countries. Varies from 20 to 50% depending on the study. But also because of the high risk. Those figures that I showed you for the link between connection and health outcomes are true for loneliness as well. Okay, in the remaining few minutes of my talk, I want to turn a little bit to work and tell you what we've learned from this study about work and maybe one part of the good life. And the first thing that's important to recognize is that most of us spend a lot of our adult time working, that a lot of our adult life is engaged in pursuits related to work. So that has some implications. One is it's an important source of meaning for people, and it also is an important source of what our experience of daily life is like. So I want you to recall John and Leo. Both of them would say they were very satisfied with their job. So John, despite being unhappy, talked a lot about his success and his commitment to sharing his knowledge. He, by all characterizations, I think would be seen as a successful worker. Leo lived a very different life, earned way less money, didn't do what his, as young people talk about today, didn't pursue his bliss. His bliss was to write, and he ended up being a teacher in a local high school. He was surrounded by others, interacted with them in meaningful ways, so he made work an important part of this kind of embedded social connections that I think buoyed him through his life. We asked participants at age 80, we followed them again across the decades. At age 80, we asked them their biggest regrets, and there is a kind of aphorism out there that no one on their deathbed talks about wishing they had worked more. It's not fully true here. At age 80, there were women in this cohort who grew up in the 20s and 30s and 40s who wish they had been more selfish and had spent more time working and pursuing their interests. But the vast majority of people talked about one primary regret, that they had let relationships wither in some way, that they hadn't paid enough attention to relationships, hadn't invested enough, and they hadn't been kind to some of the important people in their life, partners, children, coworkers, you name it. Quite extraordinary to read through these regrets. So work can be a prime ground for social connections, but there are some challenges here in the work world, and I think I'm talking to people who know this, but I want to give you my perspective. One is that many people talk about being stressed out from work, huge demands on their time and their attention. One of the challenges in today's world in terms of connection is paying attention to others, and if our attention and our energy is sapped by work, it's hard to connect. Cell phones and other technologies connect us 24/7 to work these days, so it can be really hard to detach from that. So that's another potential deconnector or anti-connector. I want to just highlight remote and hybrid work, and I'm not going to offer a solution here, but just to recognize that there are real compromises here. So one of the earlier speakers said something about the advantages of remote work for women. Absolutely true. For people who have young children, for people who are commuting long distances, there are huge advantages to remote work. On the other hand, there are costs to it as well, and the costs often come in the form of social connection, that serendipitous, water cooler conversation or coffee conversation, very hard to replicate with the technologies that we have now. The technologies are also incredible. They proved how important they were during the lockdown parts of the pandemic. They're incredibly important for connecting us, but they're different than in-person communication. We're learning this more and more. We're doing some research on this. And the affect, the emotion in those virtually mediated conversations is lower. Some people say great, but affect connects us. And what's also lowered is that we only have a picture of people's torsos typically. And what that means is we can't really see the full bodily expression, the nuanced body language. We're also missing the synchrony that we often enjoy in person. So we're missing something right now. The technologies may figure out a way to meet that, but for now, they're not the same, the experiences that people are having in that technology world. It's not just remote work that we need to think about. So this is intended to be a picture, I think it is, of an Amazon warehouse. And people can go for miles working in these warehouses at night and not see other people. So many people are quite isolated in the work environments that they're in. I work at a university. People are coming back gradually still from the pandemic, and many of my colleagues talk about feeling isolated and disconnected, even though we live in a very social environment. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, maybe it's irony, young people in college report some of the highest rates of loneliness as well, and my colleagues are reporting that they're feeling lonely these days. So it's not just the Amazon warehouse workers that face isolation at work. So a few thoughts about improving social fitness, things that we can do. Spaces and places to interact are important. Maybe we'll get to them virtually eventually with new technologies, but they're often physical. So in workplaces, we're talking about cafeterias, gyms, daycare, people bond when they have children. In communities, it's community gardens, green spaces, libraries, playgrounds. These are places not just where people come to gather, but they do activities in which they're in close proximity to others. That's how we often make new acquaintances and friends. Policies and procedures that foster social connection, so everyone needs to think about that, particularly that are leading, whatever work environment they're in or whatever environment they're in. Could be a school environment. And we need to balance important, comparisons. I've heard a lot of discussion about efficiencies. Technology brings efficiencies, but we also need to balance that with the benefits of connection as well. And lastly, really important for leaders to model behaviors about social connections. So, starting meetings, talking about human experience and what days have been like, really important. Sharing those aspects of it, including people in your team in a way that humanizes them and allows them to be seen and heard, I think is an important part of this effort. So I'm going to close there and leave some time for questions. I think we're pretty good, yeah. So questions or discussion, thank you.
Hi, very interesting. Can you talk a bit about the role of social media for people who are lonely? Is it a slight improvement, a negative? What's the effect?
I think we're trying to get to the point now where we're a little more nuanced than saying thumbs up or thumbs down. So what I want to say is one of the challenges of social media, which is well known to folks, is it promotes social comparison. In the old days when I grew up at least, to figure out whether the neighbors had more than you had to kind of look at your house, look down the street, see what their car is. Now we have an entire landscape from around the world of things that people have, and they're obviously selective and highly curated in what they show us. So the social comparison part tends to make people miserable. We tend to compare ourselves to an unreasonable standard. The general idea that's coming out of research is that if we use social media for social comparison, if we scroll through and see all the things we missed, we're going to get less happy. But if we use it to connect with others, we have the potential for becoming happier. So that's one of the hints there. Again, I think these technologies will evolve. The social media companies are working really hard to try and figure out new ways of connecting people. Whether the incentives will be there or not is another question, but they're working really hard on it.
Hi. Question about the names and photographs of the two people you started with. Are those real? They're not.
So the names are not real. The stories I told you are substantively true, but I disguised some of the details. So we have commitments to the 724 original participants and the 1,300 new participants to protect their privacy. And that's partly how we've had 84% participation rate across 85 years for the study.
So the photographs are also not real?
One of them is real, but I won't tell you which one. One of them I have permission to use.
Okay.
We'll get to everybody, but I just have one. Okay.
Thank you. So all this talk about connection, and you mentioned you focused on the intimate connections. Could you talk a little bit about how you're measuring that, or like thinking about the quality of these relationships?
Yeah, so great question. So again, the question is about how we measure intimate connection, but I want to emphasize that it's all types of connection. So one of the important questions we asked in the study was, if you're scared or sick in the middle of the night, do you have someone you can call? So many people said yes, and some people who are married and had an intimate partner next to them said, I can't think of anyone I could depend on in that context. So we measure the quality of relationship in lots of different ways. We ask them to describe it for us. How satisfying is the relationship? What kind of support do you have? How much conflict do you have? We bring them into the lab and we literally get them to argue about a topic so we can watch how they resolve conflict. We ask them to talk about fears that they have, and again, we're watching for their ability to navigate what can be very challenging fears. So late in life, we ask them about fears, and many of the fears had to do with health and whether one partner would go first or the other. So we ask them to talk about that. We videotape it. Sometimes we collect some physiology data while we're doing that as well. So the answer is we try and measure it in lots of different ways. And it's the same with happiness as well when we do that.
Thank you for your talk. I'm really interested in the qualitative dimensions to the relationships. For example, like what kind of intergenerational relationships you studied, and then also cultural values. It could be that in an Italian community, family is valued more than, say, with WASPs. Yeah. So there are different cultural, religious shapings of how one can connect, and the kinds of conversations one can have that actually connect as opposed to disconnect.
Absolutely. So this is one regret I have. The book that I described, The Good Life, came out in January. Bob and I are quite proud of that book. We worked really hard on it, and we're pleased with the reaction. The one regret I have is there's an analogy I'd like to use, which is that relationships are kind of like food for us. We all need it we need that nutrition. But the flavor of that food is different depending on the culture that you come from. So there's no question that the quality of our relationships are in part influenced by our culture. They're also influenced from our family of origin and things like that. But we all need at some more core level, some basic relational needs satisfied. And that's what we're trying to highlight in this research and in the book that I described. We do get more qualitative. We haven't looked so much at the ethnic origins of the sample, although they're really interesting. To students today, that's sort of boring ethnicity in some ways, but I think it's really interesting. Lots of immigrants from Italy, lots from Ireland, poor areas in Europe that came around the turn of the century to the US. So that's an area that hasn't been well researched from these data, but they're there for someone to look at.
I have to say that here at the back, we assumed that those pictures were correct, and that one person was Italian of origin, and therefore that explained completely why they were really keen on the family. So we may have been wrong, hence the sort of previous question. But if you look at everything, including, of course, happiness, which is important, particularly later in life.
Can you talk up a little?
Yeah, but happiness, which is important later in life, connections and so on. But in reality, in terms of longevity, it comes back, really. The most important one is wealth and education. Is that right?
It's tricky, actually. So when you look at these risk factors, so I didn't put in wealth and education. In this sample, wealth has very little prediction on happiness in life, but it does have a clear prediction to how long they live, right? There's a 10-year gap. I didn't put it in those terms, but the inner city boys are living 10 years less. So really important factor. I think we're just beginning to capture the importance of relationships. And If I had longer, I would talk a little bit about why relationships are so important, but it's not just one route that they're influencing health. We're understanding more and more about how relationships actually get under our skin, influence our immune system, influence our epigenetic expression. So I think what we're going to find is that increasingly people are looking to connection to others as an important risk factor, even for longevity and late life health as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about gender differences in your sample. You mentioned that there were women, but I think probably not in the original sample.
They weren't in the original sample.
And whether that turned up later in terms of the results that you found.
Yeah. So what I want to talk about, the topics that I focused on today, the importance of relationships, are true amazingly across time, across ancestry, across culture, and across gender. That doesn't mean, again, that there are not differences in the nature of relationships. So if we look carefully in this study, there were more men than women in the study who late in life talked about having lost connections with others, college friends or kids from their childhood that they've lost touch with. Women were better at staying in touch with those friends across time. And that's consistent with the literature that's been around for a while, but those gender differences are narrowing, and if they're present still, they're present in very small sizes in younger generations. And the whole idea of gender, of course, is changing as well. But I would say the gender effects are smaller than we imagined when we began this work, not in our research, but looking across the entire literature. And it's particularly profound when you ask men and women or boys and girls about what's important to them about friendship. They say almost exactly the same things. It's about a sense of intimacy and being understood. It's very similar. That's a generational change. It's a big change, is what I would say.
So we have time for, like, I think you two had a question and you had a question. I think then we'll, yeah, just so.
Again, thank you. Fascinating. I guess given the emphasis on connectivity, were there any insights gleaned around partner selection?
Are you asking for a friend?
Yes, absolutely. My girlfriend's not here, right?
No, we haven't worked a lot on partner selection, and I think it's a really interesting topic, and the literature out there I think is kind of complicated. I'm going to tell you just one quick anecdotal answer. It's not the scientific answer, which is I've been really struck at the number of people that are lifelong friends with the person who was randomly assigned to be their roommate in college. So that's really interesting to me, really interesting. Of course, there are parts of the world where arranged marriage is still around and it works well in some cases, not well in others. Marriage in Western countries works well in some cases and not well in a lot of cases. So I don't know that we really know about the selection stuff yet.
There seems to be a growing emphasis on storytelling. Particularly, it was around before, but post-pandemic, I mean, in politics, in social, in community organizing, in marketing, in business, how does this, or does this at all fit into the models you've been talking about?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I think stories connect us, right? They're often about commonalities that we had. I began by stories, partly trying to connect with an audience that was outside my neighborhood in social science. So stories are a way to connect ourselves with each other. I think I'm the director of the data science program at Bryn College, and stories are pretty important when we tell data. So, you know, I have interesting conversations with economists in my life outside of here, and many economists are trying to describe trends. The conversation here is much more about trying to understand the nature of those trends and trying to think about mechanisms. So stories to me are really important, particularly when we talk about data, but they're also important in terms of connecting with others. So stories engage us. They should be things that we can relate to, and they animate information that we're trying to convey. Yeah, that was partly why our book has done okay, and I think part of it is that we tell some stories in that book.
Thank you very much. This is really fascinating. Just a quick question, which is bothering me as to the causality. I mean, I was imagining that a person who is very miserable sort of chap is unlikely to make many friends.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
which triggers what, so to speak?
Yeah, so this is a question about causality, a good social science question here. And what I want to say is it's likely to be bidirectional, that happy people have a higher chance, a better chance of making connections with others, and vice versa. People who are unhappy can have more difficulty. What we've done in our research and what other people have done is try and look across different types of research. So some of this is intervention research, which is experimental, giving people skills to get better at relationships, and we see some improvements in their mood. Some of it is animal research. You can look at how mice or other rat pups are reared, and you can change the nature of that rearing. So I think we're at the point, I feel pretty confident, otherwise I would not have written this book, where we can talk about connections and happiness, connections and physical health, as kind of like when we were talking about smoking and health, and the smoking company said there's no causal link, and scientists said the accumulation of evidence is clear, there's a causal link there. But it goes in both directions, so it's important, the point that you're making. It's not simply one direction. And probably it's also synergistic, we hope, as well, right? You get happy, you get more relationships, that has benefits. So that's the idea. Done?